Howdy, of you delicious people. I am here today to review the first 10 episodes of season 1 of Goosebumps. Reasonably within these 10 episodes, I really found this show to be fun, even though when really looking at it, the episodes had some slight cheese to a lot of them, or reasonably, there was some kind of corny Ash-like things, but I think that is the reason behind it all. It's supposed to be goofy on purpose. It's supposed to have an odd approach, and that's what I can really enjoy this show for being. Now, when looking back on it, because I had seen the original run on TV most of the episodes, but when looking at it, I think at some point I stopped watching just because at some point it was just like, yeah, the episodes were either repetitive or I don't know. There was just something about them. Like I think during the time where I'm like, dude, I don't need a show that grosses me out. Like I don't need a show that ultimately is going to uh because especially this show hit right as after school got out, so you would go home to watch Goosebumps. I'm like, dude, I don't want to have freaking stuff burrowing in my head for the entire day, like thinking about eating spaghetti and seeing worms and stuff. Like I don't need to see that. Nobody needs to see that in my life. So when going into watching this show, there was some kind of weird, bizarrish method to their madness. When really looking at it, also I have been playing Goosebumps Horror Town on the other channel. So ultimately, if you guys really enjoy Goosebumps, you can go ahead and check out the game Goosebumps Horror Town via the other channel that I have called Grim Death Games. So I've been doing almost, it's about roughly now 60 part series so far that I've been really enjoying and just getting a kick out of, and hope anybody would who enjoys this show will enjoy that series. I think reasonably that portion goes into much more of a book adaptation rather than the show adaptation, so wouldn't of course it go that route. So going into here, I kind of like the fact that it kind of much more reminds me of Outer Limits. I really and truly believe that this show reminds me very much of an Outer Limits kind of thing. There always is wait to the very end of the episode because there's this giant hook that you never saw coming, or you didn't really understand anything until the very last bit of the episode. That's the thing that I could really like about this show, is it kind of always has that hook at the end of every episode. Whether sometimes the hook is interesting or the hook is just kind of like, oh, that's kind of cheap. That's kind of cheesy. It's kind of whatever. But when looking at it, there are episodes that you can kind of see where the little string of where they probably got some numerous kind of references from and pulling from somewhere to come here, and but also there is a lot of interesting individuals. There are certain stories where you could say okay, this one feels like everything, this one feels like a different kind of story that I've ever heard, and then some are just like, yeah, this was probably just a filler book or a filler episode because it's adapted from a ton of books. But ultimately, I was thinking, I'm like, yeah, obviously there's some references that are coming on from these episodes where you could easily tell that there's so many times where I'd be like, yeah, this is just like so and so thing. This is just like such and such movie. This is just like such and such reference that they probably had pulled from. And so, and I, knowing exactly when this show came out, I could be wrong about these certain references. But, anyways, so far I thought that these episodes were fun. I probably would go on to watch more of these episodes. When looking at it, I gotta see how many more episodes are left. 3 after this. Whoops. I don't know. I just kept watching and watching and watching. I really just was like, well, like I don't know exactly how many episodes that I've kind of combed through so far because the episodes go really fast. So especially being every single one of them is like 20 minutes if you kind of skip the intros and the outros and stuff. So going into this show, let's ultimately go into spoilers. I have 10 episodes to talk about. Reasonably, I'm probably not going to go through every character name of the episode because reasonably, when looking at it, like there's some times where if you went and scrolled through IMDb, there'd probably be 30 different names attached to one episode, and that would probably be every single episode. So I'm going to try as much as humanly possible to remember names, hopefully, or reasonably there might be a description here or there via me looking at Netflix of each one of these episodes so I can regale you of everything that's going on here. Um, and I'm not going to read from the descriptions because who does that garbage? I'm just going to otherwise just kind of sift through and just kind of see if there's any names that pop out eventually. But I really enjoyed this thing so far, and so hopefully, because it kind of gave me a bit of nostalgia of me just like going home every day and just watching this show. Bizarrely, I don't know why I watched it. I think it was one of those where, like, I think my like. Here's the thing: I never actually watched really. Well, that's not true. Like, I got to watch like Saturday morning cartoons, but then also like I think when I was younger, like I got to watch like a lot of my own TV at my own time. Like reason I stood up really late compared to everybody else just so I could watch like my own kind of TV and watch whatever I wanted. And so reasonably now that basically that's out the window. Basically I'm just going through streaming and just watching whatever I want through that at my whatever is at my fingertips. So, speaking of fingertips, let's get out that double five to otherwise spoil these episodes. Just a fun throb of nostalgia when really going through this, and I don't like to use that word because it just like I don't know, like using the word like oh it's nostalgia, it's reminding me of of a time or whatever. When looking at it, like those times weren't like all that great to tie on to nostalgia. I just remember like going home and every single like time I would be going home from school, just be like, oh, another episode of Goosebumps. Okay, like I guess I'll get into this. Like it wasn't my option. It was just well, I guess this is what the I guess you can call them the kids are watching nowadays. Like, because I ended up watching like Buffy, and I ended up watching like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the TV show. I ended up watching Goosebumps. And none of them were all just like, yeah, this is my plan to watch it. I don't know. I think I probably also got to like probably friends watched episodes with me or whatever. I don't know. I don't know who all watched it. It was so long ago. I don't remember it. So let's get into it. Let's get into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about the time to get to spoil Goosebumps. So again, not very descriptive on all of the character names, but I'll just kind of bring things up as it comes up. So, the girl who cried monster. So, reasonably, each one of these episodes are going to be otherwise tied to uh, books, of course. So, ultimately, you can check those out. I don't know where I was going with there. But ultimately, you can check this whole show out on Netflix right now, the current of the second recording. But yeah, so going into this, I'm gonna probably also tie like Goosebumps Horror Town to this story as well, because I was like, oh, now I actually have a voice for a number of these people because I didn't know who they were at first. So the girl who cried monster. So ultimately, have a girl named Lucy that seems to be a very Nancy Drew-esh like person immediately. That's what popped into my mind when ultimately you have a female girl that ultimately is getting down and fighting the mysteries, the clues. So we seemingly have it to where Lucy is going to the library and consistently checking out monster books. Why, I don't know, but recently we have it to where seemingly Mr. Mortman ultimately is taking offense to Lucy consistently getting monster books. It seems like ultimately we have it to where Mr. Mortman is ultimately like suggesting other things for her to read, and she's like, "No, I'm really into these monster books." So, because we end up having it to where every single one of these episodes, there's always a there's always a female girl that is humiliating either a younger boy or just a boy. That is her brother, of course. I'm like, so basically every single one of these episodes, for the most point, it seems, there's always, if there's a brother sister combo, it's usually the sister being the older sister and having to ridicule or make fun of or have to forcibly protect her younger brother for some reason. I don't know why, with the exclusion of sometimes it being the opposite, where there's an older brother but the younger sister is still like heckling the crap out of um, the older brother. I don't know what it is. I don't know why it is that combo comes up quite often. So, we have it to where ultimately it seems that the older sister Lucy, I believe in this episode, is going and telling her brother scary stories so that way ultimately he will consistently live in fear. So, we end up having it to where eventually we have seemingly Lucy trying to figure out Mr. Morkman. And so eventually she goes to the library late at night where Mr. Morkman eventually changes in a big, scary Ash like monster. And, like, to me, I'm like, okay, like, compared to Goosebumps Horror Town, what Mr. Morkman comes into, and uh, this variation of, like, very heavily different. Like basically the eyes are just kind of like bobbing in there, like bobbing and weaving, and I'm like, okay, this is interesting. So we eventually have it to where Lucy ends up sneaking into seeing Mr. Mormon change into a monster, and Mr. Mormon ends up kind of chasing after Lucy, and then ultimately he ends up giving up, and he's like, "Well, I'll see you later, Lucy." So we eventually have it to where Mr. Mormon ends up going into, and I'm really quickly, really pushing through a lot of this episode because there's 10 episodes to talk about here. So we end up having it to where Mr. Mormon goes in and greets Lucy's family, and ultimately it seems like they're going to be having dinner. And I'm like, okay, I'm like, this immediately reminds me of like the movie Lost Boys, where you have it to where somebody gets invited to dinner and something goes horribly awry, because ultimately it does. So, and we ultimately have it to where we have Lucy have seemingly a best friend of sorts. That it seems that that he goes in and is trying to help Lucy at points in time and whichever and what have you. But moving on. So we have it to where Lucy is ultimately with Mr. Morkman, and she's just terrified. She's like, "Oh my God, Mr. Morkman is at my house, and he's gonna have my parents for dinner." But instead, we have the good old switcheroo, where we end up finding out that the parents are these like snake monsters, and like kind of like in Goosebumps Horror Town, it kind of looked like Mrs. Black, who ultimately like full on skin costume Ashley person. But anyways, we have it her ultimately. So the snake mother and father end up eating Mr. Morkman, and so then we end up finding out that their parents' prime purpose in life is to ultimately find monsters and ultimately to eat them and kill them because evidently that's their thing, I guess. So we end up having it to bizarrely be that there is seemingly there's seemingly a monster that is outside the window, and we have it uh, to where this family is otherwise deciding like, oh, okay, it's time for round two, and then we end up having it to where seemingly Lucy's best friend is otherwise unmasking himself and going ha 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 ha, and we have it to where the parents are like ha ha ha, like we're gonna eat you anyways. That's our plan. So ultimately, like, I really liked this concept. I think the concept was really interesting to basically have like a librarian be a monsterish thing, because you could have it to a reasonably like, who's gonna know exactly what's going on in a library, because you go in a certain stack of books and who would know, like somebody would probably go missing in the library for whatever reasons. So reasonably, yeah, like justifiably, you can really understand how basically people could die being a librarian, if you know what I mean. Anyways, moving on. It came from beneath the kitchen sink. Oh my god! So we have an entire episode seemingly about a what is to look like a regular sponge, but this sponge is, it has teeth, it has eyes, and it ultimately, whenever you're going to grab a towel, it otherwise grabs a hold of you. So we have this thing, I believe it's called a gruel, that ultimately is seemingly consistently trying to attack this girl in her home consistently. Just consistently going after her, won't let it go. And so we ultimately have it to where seemingly that this girl, who I don't know the name of, but I know she's a really legitimate actor because I've seen her in tons upon tons of things at this point. We ultimately have her go through and realize that this is a gruel or a growl or a gruel. I think it's a gruel. So she ends up going and giving it to her science teacher, which that's what always happens, aka the faculty. Yeah, always give the yeah, in Gremlins too, the first one. Yeah, always give the monsterish thing to your science teacher, because they will wind up dead or possessed or whatever, because evidently they just suck at their job, to be brutally honest. No offense to any real science teacher that is actually good at their job. Any time you put a science teacher in a movie or a show and you give them some monsterish alienish thing, they are going to die from it, or aka also Green Lantern. When you have the guy dissect Abin Sur, he becomes, I'm never going back. I'll never go back. I'm gonna possess you and control you, Tim Robinson. Tim Robinson? Tim Robbins? Tim Robinson? I think it's, anyway, mood point. So we end up having it to where, so we have ultimately found out that this is a gruel, and evidently you cannot give a gruel to anyone once you seemingly inherit this thing. If the previous gruel owner had died, I guess you are the inheritor of the gruel. We end up finding out that seemingly that this girl has to run off to her science lab to go and find this thing, because now she has to do the approach of Ghostbusters 2 slime approach, where ultimately we have it to where we find out ultimately what the girl's weakness is while going through here. We ultimately seemingly have some janitor who's saying, "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine." and all this and that, and like all inspirational music. And so we end up having it to where the Gruul is ending up attacking people and whatever, what have you. And so we end up finding out that the Gruul's weakness is either seemingly music or just an uplifting tonal music. I'm not quite sure. But it seems that ultimately the Gruul ends up growing in seemingly smaller size, but then eventually when the music stops, we end up finding out that there's some chemicals within the science lab that is making this thing grow. So we end up having it to where seemingly the way to defeat this thing is to have it to where ultimately this girl goes and puts this thing in a jar of sorts and ultimately just forcibly has it listen to music all day long to nullify the Gruul. So ultimately that is the near dear answer. We ultimately have it to where the girl ends up going and retrieving her dog to find that there's seemingly some potato of sorts that ultimately this dog has, and then that potato has a mouth, which I thought was just gross. I'm like, God, I remember this episode and I was like, God, this is such a gross episode. Like, it was just like there's some stuff that you just don't. Well, I guess you could do, because when looking at it, there was so many numerous things that ultimately I was just like, God, this is so gross. Like when looking at so many shows and so many movies and whatever, and I always thought that these things were just so like disgusting, and why would they do this? Like, good God. But moving on. So ultimately we have the Cuckoo Clock of Doom. Ultimately we have it to where Michael is to ultimately seemingly have a younger sister that is consistently wreaking havoc upon his life. And so we ultimately have it to where Michael is wishing that Tara would never have existed. So we end up having it seemingly where Michael is having the worst possible birthday that he could possibly have, and it's all really tied to his sister. So we end up having it to where Michael ends up going and seemingly wanting to impress his friends or impress a girl or impress any number of people, like maybe his mom. I don't know. It's weird. It's weird. So we end up having it to where Michael is to go and bring in the cake, because ultimately his mom's like, hey, can you bring in the cake, Michael? And Michael's like, yeah, I might as well help out my mother because I'm nice. So we end up having Michael bring in the cake, and we have it to where Tara ends up going out of her way to trip Michael and have Michael get a big old face of cake right in the face, because face. So we end up having it to where everyone is laughing at Michael. I'm like, ah ha ha, what a schlub. Nice job there, buddy. Like, you could have saved some cake for everybody else, you know. And blah, blah, blah. So we end up having Michael having supposedly the worst birthday ever. And so he ends up deciding to mess with his father's cuckoo clock, because that's just what everyone does. We end up having it to where seemingly the cuckoo clock ends up shooting out a bird, and we end up having Michael twist the head of the bird, and then the bird ends up going back. So we end up having Michael revisiting the exact same day bizarrely over again. So time is supposedly going backwards now. So we end up having Michael going like, this is my birthday, is it? Like, I thought that was yesterday. Like, basically the same old, like, Groundhog's maneuver, but when looking at it, like, we have it to where Michael is going backwards in time for every one of his birthdays, bizarrely. I guess just every year of his life, but I guess the real bullet point parts of his life. So we end up having it to where Michael is going through that same birthday, and again, he is left with cake on his face by the end of it, because ultimately he couldn't figure out how to maneuver it better to avoid Tara's cake and face. So we end up having it to where ultimately Michael was, I think, 12, and then ultimately it seems that he had gone back in time to when he was 7. So we end up having it to where Michael goes and tries to go and find this cuckoo clock to adjust the bird back of his head to figure that that has to solve everything. So we end up having it to where seemingly Michael is to ultimately be seemingly 7, I think. And we have it to where ultimately Michael could not get to the clock on time because ultimately the clock store was closed. So we end up having it to where Michael ends up telling his parents that ultimately he's like, yeah, like I don't think there'll be a tomorrow. Like I just think that I'll end up just like I think I'm just gonna end up just dying or whatever. Like something's gonna happen to me. Like I don't know. Like and so we end up having his parents just being like, dude, you're a freaking weird kid, you know? We end up having it to where ultimately, so Michael ends up going seemingly further back in time to be a young child. And so we end up having it to where he's like basically baby time period and there is no existence of Terra. So we end up seemingly have it to where ultimately Michael and his father decide to go to the clock store, good enough for him, right? And so we end up having it to where Michael, as a baby, ends up going and adjusting the cuckoo clock with the bird on it. And so ultimately, we end up having Michael going back to current timed Michael to ultimately end up finding out that there seemingly was an adjustment done on this clock to ultimately remove some year, which ultimately would tie to Tara being born. So ultimately, Michael is like, oh, well, I guess Tara isn't a thing in my life. Oh, well, maybe I'll just have to go back in time someday to correct that. But it just won't really be now that I'll do that. I'm like, when looking at it, I'm like, well, that's basically what he bizarrely wanted this whole entire time. And then plus two, like when looking at it, like I would just be like, dude, if you're gonna go and do time travel, you can mess up all kinds of things. That's why I would never want to actually be involved in a story that involves time travel. Because if you sneeze on somebody, you're gonna f up a lot of stuff. If you go back in the past. Like if you fart on somebody the wrong way, you're gonna end up dead. Because freaking who knows? Who knows the tolerance of time periods and stuff like that? So you can freaking end up with egg on your face, especially if you're a klutz. No, klutzes need to go back in time. That's for sure. So moving on. So welcome to Camp Nightmare Part 1 and Part 2. So this one is a two-parter because reasonably this story is just so good that it needed to be done twice. Not the same episode, but it needed to go on further. So reasonably I would just call this like Camp Wimps, really. I'm like, God, these kids are just like wimps. God, like, slap a band-aid on it and just get on with your day. Like, good God, these kids. So we end up having it to where it's seemingly that these kids get off this bus and we have it to where like the bus driver is just flinging their crap off of the bus, ultimately just like, sucks to be you, I'm out of here. So we end up having the camp counselor all hippie and skippy and like, yay, everybody. Hey, everyone. This is camp nowhere or camp nightmare or whatever it is. Welcome aboard. And so we end up having it to where there's seemingly a camp counselor that is just so hippie and skippy as per usual for any counselor. But also we have another younger counselor that is ultimately just like, like I don't want to deal with all these young kids and like. So why is he a counselor? Like God, there's so many times where this younger counselor is ultimately just like ultimately just kind of correcting the kids and ultimately just like telling them that they're all ignorant or they're stupid or they're going to get themselves killed and whatever kind of thing. And ultimately, a lot of times he's like, dude, just slap a band aid on it. You'll be fine. I'm like, what's a broken arm? Slap a band aid on it. I got stabbed in the chest. Slap a band aid on it and walk it off. Like, that is what this camp kind of really does. So we end up having it to where ultimately we have these kids end up going all in this bunk, and so we end up having seemingly one kid who seemingly is a lemon, because there's quite a few lemons within this group of kids, and so we end up having it to where ultimately seemingly there is one kid that ends up going and finding a snake within his bed. We end up having the kids take the bed sheet and swing it outside of the camp room. We end up having the young, just annoyed of everything of his life camp counselor come in and ultimately like, "You guys threw a perfectly good sheet out the window. What are you doing?" And ultimately, it's like, dude, like there was a snake in that sheet, and he was like, I think you're telling me some bullshit right now. You're telling me some bullshit. So we end up finding out that there was a kid that ultimately had gotten bitten by this snake, and we ultimately have the young counselor that's ultimately just like, well, just put a band-aid on it, you'll be fine. And so ultimately we have it later on to where ultimately the kids are all singing Kumbaya, and I think really the older counselor is ultimately getting a little bit too into it, if you know what I mean. So we end up having it to where there's a main kid that ultimately seems to be the focal point because he's probably the more much more actor out of pretty much any of the other people, so he has to kind of be the one. So we end up having it to where this kid ultimately goes off and checks on the kid who ended up getting the snake bite. So we end up finding out that seemingly this kid is like half numb and ultimately like he's probably like purple and who knows what else. And we ultimately have it to where the older camp counselor is ultimately checking on this kid and ultimately going to, because he's kind of annoyed that they're messing with his music, they're messing with his song, and ultimately we have it to where it's like, dude, you just interrupted my lullaby, you just interrupted my music time. And so now we have it to where this elderly guy checks on the kid with the snake bite and ultimately looks at him and ultimately tells him like, you know what, like, I don't think this snake bite is actually that bad. Like, once you get into the next morning, you're gonna be right as rain. And ultimately toward this kid is like, are you sure? Because I ultimately feel like death. And he's like, yeah, I think you'll be fine. So cue us eventually having it to where seemingly, so these kids go and we eventually have it to where the snakebite kid ends up mysteriously vanishing for reasons we don't understand. And so ultimately we have it seemingly where these guys all decide to go ahead and just play baseball for a day. So we end up seemingly have one kid getting smacked in the freaking head because we seemingly have it to where the young camp counselor ends up full speedingly just cranking freaking the ball into this kid's head and knocks him over, and supposedly he has a concussion. So we end up having it to where reasonably like this kid has full on concussion, and we have to where the kid is just like dude, like he has clearly a concussion, and reasonably it's just like, well, we don't have concussion tests here, so I don't think he has a concussion. I think he's just playing. Walk it off. Just put a band-aid on your head and you'll be fine, kind of thing. So we end up having it to where this kid ends up going bizarrely missing for freaking reasons not understood. So we eventually have it at some point that these kids are just kind of like they're desperately going and trying to find if there's a phone that works, and the older camp counselor is like snooping in on finding this kid, ultimately trying to find a phone that works, and he's ultimately like, there's no phone that works. So we end up having it to where reasonably that this kid ends up going into the forest, and eventually there seems to be some wild animal within this forest, and so it seems like this kid ends up going and having a showdown with this monster and or winning, to really just promote that it seems that this kid is just braver than all the rest. So it seems that ultimately this camp counselor just jumps out of the bushes to ultimately tell this kid, like, hey, you won. You did it. You accomplished. You achieved. You believed. You could do this. Like, hey, he passed everybody. He passed. So we end up having, bizarrely, this kid's parents coming out of the bushes, bizarrely, and I just don't quite understand why. And we ultimately have it to be said that reasonably this entire time, everything that was going on was to test this kid to ultimately see if he were to stand up against the odds. Like he was supposed to have some examination test to ultimately see if he could qualify to go onto Earth, to be an explorer on Earth. Because ultimately it seems that this is some alien planet that looks like humans, and so ultimately they're going to send people off to Earth to go and F with those guys, I guess, I would assess. Really, I thought that this episode kind of reminded me of just a bunch of like camp movies, like especially like Friday the 13th, where we just kind of have like a lot of times where eventually people would get hurt, and ultimately somebody would just be like, well, so just slapped a band-aid on it, you'll be fine. Like ultimately just put a brace on your arm, you'll be fine. And like those are always those kinds of stories and whatever, where it's just like you have it to where people are just like, well, buck up, because you're like I thought those stories were ultimately just hilarious and sad though, but hilarious. So let's ultimately go and move on into other episodes. So we have a tour of the Phantom of the Auditorium, which is quite obviously a copy and paste steal job from Phantom of the Opera. It's pretty obvious. Because reasonably we have it to where it's basically the same story. We ultimately have it to where there's kids in school they're putting on a play, and it seems that ultimately they are bizarrely putting on the one play that ultimately one ghost wants to be a part of. So we ultimately seemingly have this phantom play going on, and we have it to where seemingly one kid comes into wanting to be with this girl, Brooke, and it seems that eventually once he because he keeps kind of stalking her and creeping after her to the point where ultimately he's writing in blood that ultimately like he'll come for her kind of thing. And so we eventually have it to where the teacher's ultimately kind of like accusing other kids like, who's doing this? But ultimately it's quite obviously the Phantom. So we eventually have it to where seemingly this Phantom excuse me, Phantom goes into going and coming out of this like kind of bizarrish like I would call it like trapdoor of sorts, to ultimately have Brooke seemingly arm to arm with a Phantom, or ultimately we have it to where seemingly this Phantom has fire in his eyes. It's crazy. So we seemingly end up finding out that Brooke realizes that this Phantom ultimately have been wanting to play this role for decades upon decades, and him having the ability to play this role ultimately was the big huzzah that he's always ever wanted. And so ultimately him being able to play this role ultimately let him kind of leave this world, I guess, just happy that ultimately he had been able to finally play the role that he's always ever wanted to play. When really looking at it, I thought that story was interesting, but very copy and paste. There's quite a bit of goofy ghost stories that aren't actually all that good, or when looking at it, like they kind of come off to be just very just like, what were they thinking? This is like the weirdest episode ever. Like, I guess there's got to be some episodes via this that eventually have to be clunkers at some point, and maybe soon we are going to really get to that point of clunker episodes. So, ultimately, the next episode is Piano Lesson Can Be Murder, or Piano Lessons Can Be Murder. Here is the probably the clunkiest episode, story, whatever, of this show. To be brutally honest, we ultimately have it seemingly where there is a kid that ultimately sees a piano at his home that is seemingly playing itself, consistently playing itself. We ultimately seemingly have it to where Jerry seems to otherwise decide, you know what, maybe I should just take piano lessons because ultimately this ghost just loves the piano for some reason. So we ultimately have to where Jerry ends up going and deciding to just go, you know what, I'm going to go and find the creepiest piano teacher I could quite possibly find. And so we end up having it to where Jerry ends up going to this piano teacher, and it seems like everything's going well. It seems like every portion of music has something to otherwise tie into the Goosebumps theme. That's the most annoyingest thing about this show is they get very, very just repetitive with the Goosebumps theme. Like, I don't know how many times I would hear some variation of I would hear that like all throughout, like that's their only song that they got. That's the only thing that they got, and so otherwise they would have to like figure out how to just use that one thing of music to just try and figure out how to just sway the music to sound differently from episode to episode, and some of it would just be a mangled mess after a while. It'd be like, like what the was that? It just had to sound absurdly different for this episode. It was just bizarre. So we end up having a tour bizarrely while Jerry is getting his piano on. We end up having it to where this piano teacher ends up getting a real, just affectionate thing going on with Jerry's hands. Ultimately grabbing Jerry's hands and touching his hands and feeling his hands and loving his hands. It's weird. So we end up having Jerry run off to ultimately seemingly have some janitor that is seemingly doing the exact same thing that this piano teacher had done. And so you ultimately seemingly find out that this janitor is otherwise tied to the ancestor of this ghost. And so it seems that eventually Jerry gets off the hook because we eventually find it that there's a descendant that ultimately this ghost is going to force to play the piano for eternity, and Jerry gets off scot-free from this ghost. So very bizarre story, and ultimately it was just a really clunky episode. It was just the clunkiest of clunk. That had a boatload of clunk going all up in the trunk, if you know what I mean. Pushing on. My hairiest adventure. So, this episode doesn't really quite exactly make sense. But I guess you could ultimately say there could be any number of side effects for anything, I guess, when really looking at it. So, I guess it's really just like, hey, just don't dip your hands into anything that you see anywhere, because ultimately you never know if there's going to be a side effect on anything or not. Because stuff could happen. So, we end up having the hairiest adventure. So, really we have it to where supposedly there is this character named Larry. We end up having it to where Larry is in a band, coincidentally, that can't play a song to save their life. Really, we have it to where Larry is going to try to start putting on a show, and I'm like, wait a minute, so hold on a second. So this guy is getting booked somewhere, and nobody is yet to hear a lick of anything that he is otherwise going to provide for this show. That seems a little absurd to me. Like, wouldn't there be an upfront, like, kind of testing of what this person would do as, like, a prerequisite to see, like, what you're going to get for your money kind of thing? That's what I would do. Because who knows if these people have any lick of talent or not, or are they going to just lip sync the whole entire time and just like look like they're playing a song? I don't know. You could be getting Britney Spears, and ultimately Britney Spears lip syncs to everything, and really it's just like, well, you're getting the performance of Britney. You're getting Britney herself just dancing in front of you, probably seductively. That's what you're getting. Sure. A person that can't even sing their own songs, which ultimately people paid a lot of money to ultimately see her do that thing. So anyways, we have it to where these kids are supposedly going into this garage and playing in their band, and they otherwise find a instant tan bottle of sorts. So they end up just going like, yeah, how about we just go ahead and just lather this up all up in my body, just lather all up in here. And recently we have it to where Larry's like, well, are you sure we should just slap this all over our body? What if it's like, what if there's side effects? Like, what if this expired? What if any number of things? So we end up seemingly having it to where Larry ends up slapping this thing all over his body, and it seems like he makes a joke that otherwise he's in pain or whatever. So we end up finding out later Larry later. We end up finding out that seemingly Larry is pulling out a Teen Wolf maneuver, where it seems that consistently Larry is looking at his hand, and his hand has a huge amount of hair upon his arm. Ultimately, I think that he is ultimately hitting puberty, but I guess when looking at it, I guess no, it's just the side effect of stress. Because bizarrely, we have it to where Larry at first ends up going and just shaving his arm. Just shaving his arm. We end up having it bizarrely where Larry's getting up in the morning and shaving his arm, and we end up having it to where his father's like, "Hey son, whenever you come out of the bathroom, can ultimately you give me my razor there, buddy?" And we end up having like the son ultimately saying, "Yeah, I'll be right out." So we end up having Larry end up going and asking any number of his friends, like, "Hey, have you been growing hair in any unusual places?" To ultimately the girl ultimately is to mention, like, "No, Larry, that's a little bit of an inappropriate thing to be asking a girl, you know?" So we end up having Larry like growing so much hair that he otherwise has to tell his folks, "Hey, look at me, I'm hairy." And so we ultimately have the doctor coming in, and so the doctor's like, "You know what? I think his hair growth has something to do with stress, because there is no real rational reason. So his hair growth has something to do with stress." Bizarrely, so we end up bizarrely having this kid ending up growing more and more hair to the point of him not being able to shave it off, I guess, at this point. So we end up having it to where Larry ends up desperately calling to his parents, "Help me!" And so we eventually find out seemingly that every single. Because we end up finding out that seems that whenever Larry talks to any of his bandmates' family, we end up finding out that son of theirs seemingly never existed in their eyes. But eventually we find out that Larry ultimately exists as a pet, not as a son, seemingly. So we end up finding it to where ultimately Larry is to change into being a dog. I'm like, well, man, does that kind of suck, because ultimately Larry only has so long to live now that he's a dog. Like, it's not like he's going to live to be 100 or whatever, uh, but anyways, I guess it is what it is. So we end up having Larry ultimately now being with his friends as dogs, and ultimately I'm like, is there a Ghostbusters pun here somewhere? I turned into a dog and they helped me. So I thought that this episode was interesting because I thought it was really a really funny episode. I really liked everything about it because it was really fun. When looking at it, I'm a hairy guy as well, as you can probably maybe see barely from the camera because it's a little bit quality. But yeah, I'm a hairy individual. Yeah, I can't help it. I am half werewolf, I guess. Um, no, I'm just a gorilla. So when looking at it, it's kind of funny to have like a coming of age story in this episode. I thought that it was kind of really funny, and I thought it was like reasonably just like heck yeah, like girl, grow some hair, grow some hair, girl, all over your bate, and start growing some hair. Anyways, moving on. So we ultimately have another two-parter that is going to end this review. So, Stay Out of the Basement, Part 1, Endos. So, I kind of like this because it reminds me of Swamp Thing a little bit. Um, I think also the last episode kind of reminded me of what was it, the show where we ultimately, it's not Bitten, but it's something along those lines of like that, where we end up having it to where there was a bunch of kids that ended up transforming all into like animals, and it was such a weird, bizarre show. I think it had the guy from X Men in it. Ultimately, he kept changing into a dog. Uh, but I also don't know if it's exactly that guy or not because ultimately he has a twin brother in real life. But moving on. So, Stay Out of the Basement, I'm kind of skipping through a lot of these and just kind of ultimately the piano episode kind of reminded me of the movie The Perfection, which is kind of a bizarre film that ultimately I probably wouldn't suggest anyone to watch, but it ends up being what it is. So, Stay Out of the Basement. So, this is a two-parter, and so ultimately we have it to where we have the mother gone, and we ultimately have the father who is seemingly going mad scientist all up in everybody's grill. So we seemingly have it to where Margaret and her brother are ultimately to be dealing with her bizarrish way of which that her father is going to be living her life, or living his life, I mean. And so we end up having it to where Margaret ends up going and uh, kind of just poking fun at her dad because it seems that ultimately he's wearing a baseball cap all the time and ultimately he doesn't like sports. We ultimately seemingly have it to where Margaret is consistently poking holes in a lot of things that her father's ultimately saying. So we end up having it to where ultimately curiosity had gotten the best of these two kids, and so they end up trying to sneak into their father's lab. So their father ends up going like, "Well, hey kids, like what I'm doing is technically top secret, but maybe I'll explain a little bit to you. So ultimately, I can get your curiosity to stop." So we end up having their father ultimately mentioning about some kind of gene slicing with an animal or kind of mixing together plant and animal sorts. So, but we ultimately have it to where, like, well, their father can't tell them any more than that. So we end up bizarrely having it to where seemingly Margaret ends up kind of really going full on deep down into just consistently seeing her father at night, kind of roaming around the house and whatever. We eventually see that Margaret is seeing her father without a baseball cap on, and it seems that ultimately there are plants seemingly coming out of this guy's hair. So we end up having it to where Margaret ends up going, "Oh my god, our father is an alien." I'm like, what is this, like, Invasion of the Body Snatchers kind of approach? Sure, okay. So we end up having it to where seemingly like the more and more that Margaret and her brother end up having to be curious about what their father does, the more it seems that ultimately they are getting attacked seemingly by the plant life that ultimately their father had made. So we end up having it to where eventually we find out that ultimately, seemingly, that Margaret's father is going and giving them some kind of goop. Because we end up finding out that seemingly that Margaret's father seemingly is also eating some plant food of sorts, and he's drinking a ton of water absurdly. So we end up having it to where Margaret ends up dumping out the food that ultimately was given by her father, because ultimately it looks a little gross. And so we end up finding out that seemingly that at some point, uh, Margaret's father ends up bringing a scientist in to ultimately go and boldly go into being just probably another pot person, or probably just another person that is probably going to die. So justifiably, we end up having it to where Margaret ends up going and finding out that there is really, um, actually, her father is somewhere alive within this laboratory, and we end up having it to where Margaret's father ends up coming and saving the kids from a really, I wouldn't say save. We end up having to reasonably the whole thing ends up getting resolved, and the father ends up going and telling the kids is like, well, hey, like, yeah, it's amazing that you guys started to just like kept being more and more curious, and you started to realize that reasonably, like, I had accidentally stumbled upon making a clone upon myself of a plant person, and ultimately he just took control and just just tied me up and just took control of my life. How could that have happened? Who would have known? So we end up having it to be that is the wrap up of this episode. And ultimately, I kind of liked it. There was a lot of like, I liked that this episode was kind of a real like build and like a real slow burn. And like, I liked that there was so much like suspicion and stuff like that. As well as kind of like a lot of these episodes I did kind of remember at some points, but I probably don't remember the ending of all of them. Like I remember bits and pieces about them, but when looking at them, I didn't remember like the full fledged ending of it all. So it was kind of nice to ultimately go into this and just be like, oh yeah, like I can like I think that some of these episodes were kind of predictable or formulaic. So ultimately, I could just assess that it's like, oh, okay, so it has to be something to do with the parents by the end of this, or oh, it has something to do with um, the father, and then the father like is going to turn out to be like hidden somewhere or something like that, or like I like ultimately could have just figured out that there is some bigger bizarre plot that makes no sense because ultimately ending of Goosebumps episodes tend to not make sense at some points in time and junctures and whatever have you. So at the end of the day, I think that's all I wanted to say about all these episodes. I want to quickly get out of here. So this video isn't very long. So I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.